Hello, today I will tell you a very different story, and this story is unique. You will be shocked when you listen. Now let's get to the story. The Canadian Rocky Mountains are the Canadian segment of the North American Rocky Mountains and extend from the Montana-British Columbian border all the way to just south of the Yukon Territory. This gives them a total length of approximately 1,500 kilometers, 932.1 miles. They're also around 200 kilometers, 124.2 miles, across, giving them a total area of 200,000 square kilometers, 124,274.2 square miles. For context, if the Canadian Rockies were in Florida instead, they would completely cover the entire state and overflow into their northern neighbor, Georgia. And although they're not quite as tall as their southern counterparts, because they're farther north, they get significantly more permanent ice and snow. All of the glaciers gouging up the surface of the Canadian Rockies has given them a much more jagged appearance over time. This is in contrast to the much more rounded features of the American Rockies. Nowhere is this more apparent than the iconic drive between Banff National Park and Jasper National Park on the Alberta-British Columbia border. The highway through this area runs right through the mountains, and their prominent rocky peaks are displayed on either side the entire distance. Early morning on April 1, 1983, 28-year-old university student James and 33-year-old Richard were climbing a mountain known as Delta Form along this stretch of roadway. This 11,234-foot, 3,424.12 miles, peak is the tallest in an area known as the Valley of 10 Peaks and has the quintessential sheer, jagged look of the Canadian Rockies. From their camp that morning in the valley, they tracked about 2 kilometers, 1.24 miles, to where they would start their climb. This area is still in the tail end of winter in early April, and so there's still significant amounts of ice and snow on the peaks. Using ice tools, they ascended up a steep ice gully between two rocky sections known as an ice couloir. The pair also climbed rope together and set ice screws as protection on the steep ice. As Richard planted one of his tools, a chunk of ice broke off and plummeted down towards James. He yelled down to let James know, and then the two of them watched it tumble down the mountain. But then they heard the horrifying roar of an avalanche that cut loose after the chunk of ice. The tons of snow quickly swept the men down the couloir and 2,000 feet, 609.6 meters, down the mountainside. James woke up sometime later and had no idea where he was or what had happened. Unfortunately, it was clear that he was horribly injured. His back was broken in 2 places, his arm was broken, his other shoulder blade was shattered, he had cracked ribs, torn ligaments in his knees, a broken nose, broken teeth, internal bleeding, and there was blood everywhere around him. For a moment, he actually thought he was in a different mountain range that he had spent time in months earlier, but gradually, he realized where he was and what he'd been doing. Then, he realized he'd been with Richard and he had no idea where he was or what state he was in. He painfully made his way to his feet and saw Richard nearby. Tragically, it was clear from his injuries that Richard was dead. Realizing how bad his own injuries were, James assumed he was gonna die also, and just laid down next to Richard. At first, he was shivering as he lay there, but after some time, he started to get very warm and tired. He knew that this meant he was close to dying. Then, suddenly, he felt like someone was with him. Then, whatever it was spoke to him and told him that he couldn't give up. He had to at least try. So James got up and started making his way back to their base camp. And over the next few hours, this voice encouraged him and gave him practical advice. Like for example, the voice told him to make arrows in the snow with his blood, so that if someone saw them, they would lead back to him. Despite barely being able to lift his legs with each step, the voice encouraged him to keep going. Some of the time, he even crawled because of how badly injured he was. But all the way back to camp, the voice was directly over his right shoulder, telling him exactly what to do. Finally, he made it back to camp, and although it was only 2 kilometers, it had taken him almost the entire day. When he got back to camp, he couldn't even get into his sleeping bag. He couldn't eat and he couldn't light his stove because of how badly injured he was. By then, it was also late afternoon and it was starting to get dark. He knew that he wouldn't survive the cold night, and again, he was so tired and injured, he just figured that this would be the end. Then, he thought he heard some other voices and the voice told him to call out. So James yelled out for help and told him he was in an avalanche. But then, unfortunately, the voices were gone and so was the voice over his shoulder. He figured that this meant the voice also knew that his situation was hopeless, and so it too had left him to die. But then miraculously, moments later, some skiers skied up to his camp. They happened to be the only ones in the area and they had heard his cry for help. James now realizes that the voice hadn't left him to die, it only left him when he was rescued. This voice that James heard is actually a known phenomenon called the third man factor or third man syndrome. The first reported occurrence of this in modern human history was by the legendary explorer, Sir Ernest Shackleton. In his 1919 book, South, Shackleton described a bodiless companion that joined him on the final leg of his Antarctic journey. This was also experienced by legendary climber Reinhold Messner and polar explorers Peter Hillary and Bancroft. Apparently, this phenomenon is most commonly observed in climbers, solo sailors, and polar explorers in dire situations. Modern psychologists believe that this third man factor is a way of coping with severe trauma in life or death situations. James has never experienced this since, but is confident that he wouldn't have been able to survive the situation otherwise. Since I started covering mountain climbing stories on this channel, I've wanted to cover many of the great epics and disasters from the 8,000 meter, 26,247 feet, peaks. The reason that I've held off is that much like the mountains themselves, these stories are kind of overwhelming. Similar to technical cave diving, there's a lot of context to establish to fully grasp the situations that many of the climbers found themselves in. These include things like the month-long or more expeditions, the literal tons of equipment, the events, the technical climbing, and even the weather. And not only do I enjoy covering these aspects, but I think most people enjoy learning about them as well. So I really want to do them the proper justice, but it is a large undertaking and so I've held off. But this next topic provides a nice prelude to some of that information and some of the challenges faced by people in the world's highest peaks. This won't necessarily be comprehensive, but it'll provide a good introduction, I think. This is the story of the Rainbow Valley. Since people have started climbing mountains and started taking mountain climbing seriously, the logical progression of the activity for any climber is to climb higher and more challenging mountains. Mount Everest is therefore the pinnacle of this pursuit because it's the highest of them all. And this is evident in the fact that it's by far the most climbed of any of the 8,000 plus meter peaks. Even if you don't know anything about mountaineering, you understand why it would make sense that the highest mountain on Earth is an accomplishment. But with this popularity, there's also more death even if the death rate is relatively low. Because although Mount Everest is far from the most dangerous of the 8,000 meter peaks, it has the most deaths by far because it's the most climbed. It's for this reason that it has 3 times the number of deaths of any other 8,000 meter mountain. An underappreciated aspect of these climbs, despite how well known they've become in recent years, is just how much equipment needs to be transported to the various camps along the way. These mountains are so large and take so much time to climb that they have to be climbed in stages. So what mountaineers have done is establish a series of camps at different heights along the way where climbers can stop and sleep and rest and acclimatize in their long journey to the top. Each camp is sequentially higher up the mountain, making the air thinner and the climbing more challenging. As you get higher as well, it's colder and there's more permanent ice and snow as a result. The highest regularly established camp that climbers use to make the final push to the top is at 26,000 feet or 7,924 meters. This is just below the fabled death zone, which is at 8,000 meters. As the name of their grouping suggests, These 8,000-meter peaks are the only mountains above that height and are therefore the only mountains where climbers climb into this death zone. This is the point at which the pressure of oxygen is too low to sustain human life. This is in contrast to sea level where the human body functions best. This is because the air at sea level pressure allows the oxygen-carrying red blood cells within the body to be fully saturated with oxygen. Without enough oxygen, your cells slowly cease to function, so in the death zone you are literally slowly dying. The body can adapt to a degree. If you spend time at low pressures, the body detects this lack of oxygen and responds by creating more blood cells to carry more oxygen. But there are limits to this process. That limit is 8,000 meters. In addition to this, it takes time to adapt. Generally, you have to spend days and up to weeks in this environment for these adaptations to occur. Otherwise, you'll suffer from altitude sickness, pulmonary edema, and cerebral edema, all of which can be fatal, especially under exertion, like if you were climbing a mountain, and this is just one of the challenges that people face on these peaks. They also have to battle extreme cold and wind, rapidly changing weather, avalanches, rock falls, and the extreme challenge of the mountain climbing. It's for this reason that these mountains represent the pinnacle of mountaineering. And for the same reason, it also makes carrying supplies up incredibly difficult and often not worth it to carry supplies down. This includes carrying down the bodies of anyone who dies on the mountain. So below the northern ridge of Mount Everest is the infamous Rainbow Valley, which is named for the numerous colorful bodies that are there permanently. Mountaineers have accomplished. For his descent, Marco planned to snowboard an area known as the Hornby Couloir. This was the spot that he personally considered to be the holy grail of snowboarding. Unfortunately, though, there wasn't enough snow on that route when he arrived. Ironically, this makes climbing the mountain much easier, but would make it impossible to snowboard his original planned route. So instead, he chose a different area known as the Norton Couloir. On their way up the mountain, it snowed enough that this route seemed doable. Then, on the day before Marco's planned summit, Stefan reached the summit. He then continued on with his planned descent and snowboarded to 8,600 meters, 28,215 feet, but he got to an area of snow that was very hard and very dangerous, so he walked down another 100 meters or so of the steepest section. Then, he successfully snowboarded the rest of the route from there. The following day, Marco also successfully summited and then latched into his board and started down. For hours later, he snowboarded into the advanced base camp, a legend. Although Stefan had done it first, many people credited Marco because it was a true continuous descent of the highest mountain on Earth. Then, the following year in 2002, Marco was back at base camp, hoping to snowboard his original planned route. This time, he arrived in fall when there was much more snow on the mountain. On September 6th, he ascended to high camp, where he even lied to his parents and told them he was lower so they wouldn't worry. On September 7th, he ascended to Camp 3 on the edge of the death zone. And then on September 8th, Marco and a team of Sherpas successfully summit Mount Everest once again at 2:10 p.m. But rather than being excited about making it to the top, Marco was exhausted. The snow was chest deep and the climb had taken 3 times longer than a normal ascent because of it. After sitting for a few moments to catch his breath, Marco prepared his gear for his descent. As he was doing this, some clouds were forming down below that was concerning to the Sherpas. And it was also getting late in the day, and so they asked him to reconsider. But this was now a life's work for Marco. Not going was not an option. So after slipping into his gear, he dropped onto the slope and made a few zigzags back and forth. Then, he waited for the Sherpas to catch up and pass him on their descent route. Once they had passed him, he headed for the Hornby Couloir. A couple hours later, the Sherpas descended to Camp 3 and noticed what looked like a man stand up and slide down the mountain about 1,300 meters, 4,265 feet, below them. But when they finally reached that area, there were no tracks. And when they finally reached the meeting spot, Marco was not there. In fact, Marco was never seen again and his body has never been found. He could have fallen or he could have been swept away in an avalanche. But unfortunately, it's likely that we'll just never know. And this is the same story of many of the great alpine adventurers. Thank you very much to everyone who watched this far and hope to see you in the next video. Have a nice day.